Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, even good night for those who are in Australia. Thank you for joining us today in this important event and welcome. My name is Stefano Biancu and I am the coordinator of the PhD program in Contemporary Humanism. Contemporary Humanism is an international and interdisciplinary PhD program sponsored by 6 Catholic universities, among which LUMSA University in Italy and the Australian Catholic University. Today's event is organized by Professor Consuelo Corradi. Professor Corradi is Professor of Sociology at LUMSA University. Thank you, Consuelo, for organizing it for us. Before giving you the floor, Consuelo, let me just thank our guest, Professor Bryan Turner, Professor of Sociology at the Australian Catholic University and one of the world's leading sociologists, for accepting our invitation. Consuelo, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you, Stefano, and good morning to the Italians and good afternoon to the Australians, and in particular, Bryan. Thank you for your time and for accepting your invitation. We are really, really happy to have you for a lesson, actually a lecture. It was meant for the PhD students of the international PhD program, but online we have several colleagues and professor colleagues at LUMSA University in different fields, and colleagues, sociologist colleagues in other Italian universities. I am going to make a very short introduction of Bryan Turner. It actually is not needed. Everybody knows Bryan for his books, for his works, but it's a pleasure for me doing it. Bryan Turner is today affiliated at the Institute for Human Studies and Social Sciences at the Australian Catholic University in Sydney, but he's been world known for years. I was talking to Bryan a few minutes ago, and I think I first saw him and heard him giving a lecture in 1985 at the in New Delhi in the conference that the International Sociological Association organizes every 4 years. And at the time, we both believe, Bryan and I believe, that his topic was the body and society. And Bryan really put the body on the stage, on sociology stage. And his book was extremely well received. But I think that it really opened a field for sociology, because today sociologists who write, do research on the body are very many, and they have taken the body also from different angles, from different sociological angles. Bryan's also very well known for sociology of religion, for sociology of catastrophe. He has a recent book on catastrophe. There is a book translated in Italian on the sociology of religion. And in recent time, his interest has also turned to men and masculinities. So today he will speak to us on his interest, what it is to be a man in Australia, and why some men or many men are angry. So Bryan, the floor is yours. We have about 30 minutes or more, 35 as you wish, and then we will make sure that we will have 15 minutes for questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction and for the invitation to talk to you. A pity I can't be in Rome, but we have to do the best we can with modern communication technology. I'm going to divide my talk into three components. I'll talk about the actual research we did on the far right in Australia. I'll talk a little bit about populism, and I'll finish by talking about what I think is a crucial element of the populist and right-wing movements, which is the demographic dimension of modern right-wing politics, which is, in my view, rather neglected. In 2019, we won a research grant from the Australian Research Council to do a study of the far right in Australia. Immediately, we're hit by COVID-19. My co-researchers were in Melbourne, and so it was very difficult to actually see each other. So the whole research was done as we are today by online. And as of today, we've still not finished the analysis of the research. So we're still writing it up. We've had a few articles published already. And I don't know, in that brief period, two of us got divorced. Just about everybody had COVID-19. So the research was conducted under difficult circumstances. And these are kind of methodological notes to the postgraduates. We couldn't really do research on, we couldn't announce to people that we wanted to do research on the far right, because I'm not sure we'd have got through ethics clearance with that kind of title. And we did get emails from people saying, you must be working for the police or the government, and this is just a trap to find men on the far right so they can be scrutinized by the police or something. So all of that was kind of part of the thing. And the actual question that we asked was simply, what is it like to be a man in modern Australia? And we had 388 responses, of which 355 were credible. The survey was quite successful. A lot of people wrote extensive comments, not just answering the questions. And we also did about 54 interviews. So we have ended up with quite a lot of rich data. We couldn't really identify people on the extreme right who might take up, military weapons against the police or the government. We did find people with very conservative views about gender. And we did find lots of angry men, hence the topic of this evening's or this morning's conversation. And there were several aspects to their anger, but women was a large part of this, that they felt, for example, that the divorce laws were biased against men, that they had difficulty financially with divorce. They couldn't see their children easily and so forth. So there was a lot of hostility to women. In fact, I'd have to say that the unifying topic of their frustration and anger was what they saw as the gender inequalities in modern Australia, backed up by the law and by, the media in particular. They felt that the gender diversity that had become kind of taken for granted amongst at least the middle class in Australia was undermining what it was to be a man. And they were very hostile to what they called girly men. They had a view of a traditional Australian man as a tough guy, independent, and not subordinated to kind of middle class values or modern views of gender diversity. So the majority of the majority of the sample were under 35. Only about 10% had degrees. Most of them had what you might call trade qualifications for driving trucks or operating cranes or whatever. And they felt that women had taken over, and this is not news to anybody, women had more or less taken over white collar employment the so-called pink collar employment. That they were being forced out of these respectable areas of society because they were not as bright as many of the women who were much more successful at school or university or wherever it might have been. And on top of that, it's interesting that Australian women have made their way into lots of very traditional male areas, like, women in mining areas, women in forestry, women in farming. Now, historically, in a way, women have always been involved, through farming work in the outback on these kind of areas, but men have dominated that. And, you see these huge machines that they use for mining coal or whatever they're digging up, driven by women or with women as supervisors, which is another area of frustration for a lot of men. This was compounded by the COVID-19. Australia had a very strict lockdown policy. You couldn't travel between states. You couldn't have large meetings. Vaccination became compulsory for entering certain, if you wanted to go shopping or something, you might have to prove that you'd had a vaccination. So it was very tough. But in my view, it was a successful policy because our mortality rate was nowhere near as bad as America or some European countries or, Russia or whatever you want to be looking at. I mean, I thought the government policy was successful, but it caused a lot of backlash amongst working men. And, people who ran small businesses obviously suffered. And that was like promoted a kind of anti-government populist response to it. And it's kind of got worse because there's a lot of anti-vaccination material floating around saying that it was bogus, it wasn't properly tested, that the medical profession lied, etc., lied about it. And so that's going around at the moment, making a kind of populist rejection of that. And at the moment, I don't know, it's probably the same initially. We've got a kind of new strain of COVID on the loose at the moment, which is also causing, this debate between vaccinators and anti-vaccinators. I won't say this too loudly because I don't want to tempt fate. I'm the only person I know who's not had COVID-19 yet. And all of my research colleagues got it. My family got it. We didn't sort of have any protection. I felt there's no way I could keep away from my daughter, for example. So I don't know why I haven't had it, but I'm still keeping my fingers crossed. So a lot of these changes in Australia have been fairly widespread in Western capitalism. The increasing presence of women in not just the service sector, but in leadership roles. Perhaps less so in politics, but you can see there have been or are very influential women in politics, particularly in Europe, I'd say. And all of this fostered a kind of unified view that women were privileged, men were being neglected, falling behind. And on top of this, and I think, again, this is not limited to Australia, the cost of rent and property and accommodation in Australia has gone absolutely through the roof. I mean, I guess I'm, probably at the upper end of the middle class, but we feel the crisis of the food costs and, mortgage costs and travel costs. I mean, it's all kind of got out of hand. And so I think the pressure on the lower ends of the middle class and the working class have been extreme. Yeah. And I think, America is exactly the same. And that's promoted a lot of anti-government feeling, but also this sort of combined view of being anti-women. I think you've probably taken notice of this movement called incel, involuntary celibacy. And so I think there's that kind of view that, and I'd have to put it very bluntly, that women are not sexually available to lots of men who don't really have not a lot going for them, to be frank about it, in terms of resources or education or, whatever it may be that they need in the marriage market. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but I mean, obviously, marriage itself is in decline, isn't it? I'll come on to this when I get into my demography. So another theme that we think we're beginning to see is a kind of male nostalgia about the world that their fathers enjoyed, or their grandfathers, where, men were definitely in charge. There were no laws, regulating gender behavior. And women were, obviously the target of a lot of domestic abuse, as they probably still are today, but at least there are some laws trying to regulate that. Whereas, these men's fathers grew up in an environment where, the man was definitely, the lord of the manor, so to speak. And I don't know, I remember my grandfather had this leather belt, and if any of the children or his wife were, becoming a nuisance or weren't subordinated, he would just take it off and use it, Whereas, the whole notion of parenting has kind of gone through a revolution. We'll talk probably a bit later about domestic violence. I know that Italy has a very high rate of it, but I was comparing in 2023, 70 women died as a result of domestic violence in Australia from a population under 30 million. So the proportion of women murdered or, killed by their partners or husbands was probably the same as Italy, if not worse, possibly. So, there are kind of important differences, and this is not an anti-Aboriginal statement, but violence within the Aboriginal family is still a problem that no Australian government has been able to resolve. And we lost the voice, vote recently, which I don't think actually has changed the situation all that much. But anyway, so Australia has some kind of unique characteristics, but it also has characteristics shared by Britain, Italy, America, and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering if I can say much more about the actual research we did. You can ask me questions about it at a later stage. I think there was a kind of sense that these men, this nostalgia thing, was that they felt they were almost strangers in their own land. And that's a phrase that's been used about American men in some of the poorer southern states, for example. So let me talk about populism. And I think that the populism debate hasn't been resolved, and probably any political theorists in the group today will know much more about it than me. It seems that the ambiguity of populism, on the one hand, it can be seen as a very democratic response to elites, that the bulk of the population that hasn't prospered from globalization, that suffered from inflationary pressures, that are described as the left behind, or the chavs, as they're called in Britain, or the unwanted, feel that their democratic rights have been trodden on by uncaring elites. And I think another kind of development that's become prominent since we started this research is the sheer level of corruption in the elite. I think is more fuel to a lot of populist antagonism to to elites, and the kind of misinformation that was behind, for example, Brexit, which was kind of on a populist, basis that we'll control our own borders and you'll have more money for the National Health Service. All of this was complete fabrication, and only kind of now beginning to come out. So, I mean, populism is sometimes referred to as the unwanted guest at the democratic meeting because of its ambiguity. On the other hand, we know that a lot of populism has a very strong fascist kind of component to it, particularly over foreigners, migrants, outsiders. And I mean, you know this better than I do, but the strains within the European Union with Holland, Denmark, and the very large-scale right-wing movements within what used to be East Germany have been, I mean, you can tell me about this, but I mean, this is something that's very, very obvious. There is an element of that in Australia, but Australia has been such a multicultural society, for at least the last 2 generations or more, that it's a bit too late in a way for right-wing people in Australia to say enough is enough. Or, I mean, I suppose the current thing is that Muslims can't integrate into Australian society. And I don't know if you know about the Bali bombing in, I don't know, several years ago, where 224 Australians were killed in a Bali cafe by extremist Muslims. And we've just had this kind of anniversary about this terrible episode. So, I mean, there are these events in recent Australian history that have kind of reinforced this. Populism. And I guess that the power behind, the popularity of Trump is, another manifestation of this ambiguity of, a popular protest against the so-called Washington swamp. And, the fact that it's itself run by elitists, property owners like Trump himself. And I mean, what seems to happen with all populist movements now is that if they lose the election has been lost. So you see through much of Latin America that any election that doesn't go in the direction of populism is one that's been stolen. And, Trump and his followers still go on about, the last election being a stolen election. So I think populism will not be easily managed, given some of the things I've talked about. Now, I'm going to pop a sweet in my mouth. Some of the things I've talked about: rising house prices, rise of rental prices, fears about unemployment, and so on and so forth. So let me talk about demography. I don't know whether it's because of my sociology of the body or teaching parts of medical sociology in the past that I've always had an interest in, basic demography. And I think as an undergraduate, we had to read Thomas Malthus. So I had, lots of kind of Malthus in my early undergraduate program. Anyway, I got interested in demography because what seemed to keep coming up was the collapsing fertility rate really around the world. I mean, I've lived in Singapore, which has also a collapsing fertility rate. And the government there does all sorts of changes to try to get young people to marry each other. Secondly, to have children. And thirdly, to bring them up. All of this has failed. He used to give financial rewards to people who got engaged, and more benefits if they got married. All of that failed. And now you can see that Japan has the biggest, I think, crisis of any developed country. I mean, their villages, their country villages are collapsing because they have no babies. The economy is in deep trouble because they don't have enough workers. And Japan is kind of unique that it refuses to allow any immigration. So the only, quote, non-Japanese they have are people of Korean origin. But it's virtually impossible, for example, to get a Japanese passport or, you know, to migrate to Japan and become a Japanese citizen. So I think, you know, you've got these stories that in Japan, their women in the villages are knitting effigies of human beings to make it look as though the village has people in it. And the Japanese, I think they can solve this with robots and computers. So there are hotels in Japan, apparently, where there are no human beings serving. You get a robot there that can speak about 5 different languages, a robot to collect your luggage, and, you know, so it goes on. The Japanese have robots to look after their elderly people. And I have friends in Korea, which has exactly the same, you know, crisis. And you have it throughout Europe now. Because I'm at a Catholic institution, I'm interested in Catholic societies for no strange reason. And, you know, Portugal, Spain, Italy, just to mention those, have very, very low fertility rates. To have a replacement, you have to have 2.1 children born to a woman before she gets to 49. Anything below that is not population replacement. And if that continues for, say, 3 or 4 generations, there are some demographers who say there is no way out of this crisis. There's nothing a government can do to kind of remedy that by changing taxation laws, by giving people money to have babies, by taking some of the burden off family life, to have pro-family policies, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, I mean, you know this better than I do. In Italy, Spain, et cetera, the marriage rate is declining, the fertility rate is declining. And on top of that, Italy, I think, has one of the longest living populations. I think for men and women, it's 83.7 years. So you've got this double whammy, a declining labor force, combined with a growing elderly population. Now, there are, you know, France has tried to get rid of the retirement age, but, you know, with huge protests. You can try to bring in technology, but sometimes that's difficult to find suitable technology. You can mess about with taxation rates and so forth, but there's no country so far that's really got on top of this problem. So, I mean, the current, you know, topic is AI. And I think it's so new that most of us are guessing about, you know, what's going to happen. But one report I read recently, which I thought was kind of vaguely credible, said that within 2 or 3 years' time, 47% of the labor force would be knocked out by AI. And I think for us in this meeting, academics, students, universities could be a good target for AI. I think much of the introduction to sociology could be taught by AI because it's fairly kind of basic stuff. You might need old fogies like me to teach PhD students, but as my memory begins to fade, ACU might be better off investing in AI than, professors like me. So, as I say, to repeat myself, those countries that have struggled with this for decades. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew, when I was there whenever it was in the last century, had struggled with this with no success. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew even, flew to Sweden to talk to them about their population policy because Gunnar Myrdal, the famous Swedish sociologist whose dates I've forgotten, actually wrote a very early book on population, saying that Sweden's democracy was threatened by its demographic crisis. I've forgotten, when would that be, 1940s or 1950s, something like this. So, I mean, this idea that demography and democracy have this important connection has been kind of floating around, but I think not taken seriously by sociologists. And we could talk about it. I mean, partly that demography became a very technical, mathematical area of social science, very complicated, and often housed or located outside the social science faculties, or certainly not in sociology. I mean, as an undergraduate, I had lectures on demography, partly because the head of the department was a Russian demographer who'd written the major post-war demographic report for the British government. So we had a dosage of demography as an undergraduate. So I think if technology can't solve it, and I don't see women rushing to have babies and getting married, particularly because of the cost of keeping a household together, and because they've got lots of opportunities for full-time employment. And so I think that there's no kind of quick fix to it in terms of, social policy. The only cheap solution is immigration. Guest workers used to be the ideal solution because they came and they worked hard and then they went home. And that's what happened in Holland for a very long time. And the Dutch were very happy with it. Now they've got people who want to come and stay. That people like Wilders, or whatever his name is, has been able to latch on to this as a kind of populist thing against migration. And I think in Italy, you've got, populist opposition to migration. You've certainly got it in, I won't say just Germany, but specifically East Germany for historical reasons. And the British have this lunatic policy of trying to send them to Rwanda at a cost of about 240 million pounds per flight. Whereas Britain has a declining, fertility rate and an elderly population, and a very disgruntled population that a lot of whom would say, now, can we get back into the European Union? And with regions like Scotland and Wales that never wanted to leave the European Union in the first place. So there's all these political tensions around with no, I don't think, talking about catastrophe, no really economic and effective solution to this apart from migration. And so, I think in America, the Trump people are latching onto the Latin American or South American influx of thousands of people across the, the southern border. But there are also economists who are saying, well, we need this because the American population is shrinking. And these people are cheap labor, and also they have to consume. So even if they're, impoverished, they've got to kind of somehow buy food or, get into the labor force or do something. And So I think that whilst it looks like a crisis, I think it doesn't have to be that. And given all the other solutions, it may be that migration is the only quick solution to this. And I think it's sad, you know, I mean, I read these stories and I'm going to finish soon, that, you know, these wonderful Italian villages away from the main urban centers, you know, have, you know, also like Japan, declining elderly population of people who can't actually run these villages any longer because they're too, you know, elderly and decrepit. So at the moment, I mean, Japan is investing in trying to get young people to go and live in these, you know, remote villages. But I mean, the young people want to be in the urban areas where they can find employment and all the rest of it. So Consuelo, perhaps I'll finish there and leave time for some discussion and debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bryan. You made a very wide picture, actually, of men and populism, and this is one of the reasons why I like your papers so much. I mean, most of the audience has received your two papers, one on young masculinities and angry men, and one of the reasons I like them is that it's really the big picture. Is we see the big picture. We see politics, demography, the gender dimension, and fertility. And as some of you know, I've been working on the intimate dimension of the fertility problem. And anyway, I don't want to be the first to ask you a question, so I'm leaving the floor to all of you, and raise your hand if you want to make a comment or ask a question.